115 men, women, and children crossed an ocean to build the first permanent English settlement in the New World. 3 years later, they had simply vanished. No bodies, no graves, no signs of battle, fire, or plague. Only a single word carved into a wooden coast and a fort standing empty under the sun. That word was CROATOAN, and for more than 400 years it has remained one of the most haunting unanswered questions in American history. In 1587, Eleanor Dare, likely no older than 20, gave birth to Virginia Dare on that island, the first English child born in the Americas, an ocean away from everything familiar. Their governor, John White, was forced to sail back to England for supplies, promising to return within months. It was the last time he would ever see any of them. When White reached England, he found the country bracing for war. Spain's Armada was assembling, and every available ship was ordered held in English waters. He could not go back. 3 years passed. When White finally returned to Roanoke on August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years to the day after his granddaughter's birth, the settlement was deserted. The houses had been carefully dismantled. Heavy iron tools had been buried. There was no violence, no blood, no destruction of any kind. Before White had left, he and the colonists had arranged a signal. If they moved under duress, they were to carve a cross above their destination. There was no cross. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island. To White, the word meant his people had left willingly, safely, and yet a storm prevented him from sailing those final miles to confirm it. He never reached them. He spent the rest of his life trying and failed. And the question of what truly became of those 115 souls has never, in 400 years, been answered. The wind moves across a narrow strip of sand on the outer edge of the American coastline. And there is nothing here now but grass, pine, and the low murmur of the Atlantic. But in the summer of 1587, this island held the future of an empire. It held 115 men, women, and children who had crossed an ocean to build the first permanent English settlement in the New World. 3 years later, when a ship finally returned to check on them, there was no settlement left to find. No bodies, no graves, no signs of battle, fire, or plague. Only a single word carved into a wooden post and a fort standing empty under the sun. That word was CROATOAN, and for more than 400 years it has remained one of the most haunting, unanswered questions in American history. To understand how one word could hold a mystery this large, you have to understand what England was trying to do on this island, and why the stakes of failure were so enormous. By the 1580s, Spain had already built a vast colonial empire, stretching across Central and South America, extracting gold and silver on a scale that reshaped the global economy. England, watching from across the Atlantic, had nothing to match it. Queen Elizabeth I had granted a charter to Sir Walter Raleigh, a courtier and adventurer with close ties to the crown, authorizing him to establish an English colony in North America. Raleigh himself never set foot on American soil. Instead, he financed and organized expeditions, sending others to do the work of empire building on his behalf. The first attempt, a military garrison left at Roanoke Island in 1585, had ended badly, with tensions escalating into violence with the local Algonquian-speaking peoples, and the English abandoning the site within a year. The second attempt, launched in 1587, was different in nature and in ambition. This was not a military outpost. It was meant to be a true colony, made up of families, farmers, craftsmen, women, and children, sent to build a permanent English presence in America. The man chosen to lead this second expedition was John White, an artist and cartographer who had traveled to Roanoke on the earlier voyage and had produced detailed watercolor paintings of the land and its indigenous inhabitants, images that remain some of the earliest and most valuable visual records of Native American life in the region. White was given the title of governor,
and among the colonists who sailed with him was his own daughter, Eleanor Dare, who was pregnant at the time of departure. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor gave birth on Roanoke Island to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child known to have been born in the Americas. Her birth was recorded as a moment of hope, a symbol that England's foothold in the New World might finally take root and grow into something lasting.
But the ink was barely dry on that hope before the colony began to unravel. Almost immediately, the settlers realized that their situation on Roanoke Island was precarious. Relations with neighboring native communities had already been damaged by the earlier, more aggressive English expedition, and White's colonists needed supplies, tools, and reinforcements that had not arrived as planned. Faced with mounting anxiety among the settlers, the Colonial Council made a request that would prove fatal to their fortunes. They asked John White himself to sail back to England to secure additional provisions and support. White was reluctant. Leaving meant leaving behind his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, and everyone he had brought across the ocean. But the colonists insisted, and White agreed, believing he would return within a matter of months. He departed in late August of 1587, promising to come back as quickly as English shipping would allow. It was the last time he would ever see any of them. What happened next was not a failure of will, but a collision with forces far beyond any single person's control. When White reached England, he found the country bracing for war. Spain was assembling the Armada, a massive naval force intended to invade England itself, and Queen Elizabeth's government ordered every available ship to be held in English waters for national defense. Private colonial resupply missions were for the moment irrelevant to a nation fighting for its survival. White petitioned repeatedly for a ship, and in 1588 he did manage to secure passage on 2 small vessels, but the voyage ended in disaster before it ever reached America. The ships were attacked and looted by French privateers in the English Channel, forcing White to return to England empty-handed and without having reached Roanoke at all. Trapped by a war that had nothing to do with him, White watched month after month pass while his family and countrymen waited across an ocean he could not cross. It would take 3 long years before John White finally secured a ship bound for Roanoke again. He landed on August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years to the day after his granddaughter's birth, hoping desperately to find the colony intact and his family alive. Instead, he found the settlement deserted. The houses had been carefully dismantled rather than destroyed, suggesting the colonists had left in an organized and deliberate manner rather than fleeing in panic. Heavy items, including iron tools and several chests belonging to White himself, had been buried, apparently for safekeeping, though when unearthed, they had been damaged by rain and time. There was no sign of violence, no blood, no scattered bodies, no evidence of the kind of massacre that would come to define so many darker chapters of colonial contact. And carved into the one fort's support post was the single word that would outlive every person who had lived there: CROATOAN.
White immediately understood the word's significance because it was not a mystery to him at all in the way it has become a mystery to history. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, now part of what is called Hatteras Island, home to an Algonquian-speaking people whom the English had actually maintained comparatively friendly relations with, in contrast to other groups nearby. Before departing for England, White had arranged a pre-arranged signal with the colonists. If they were forced to leave Roanoke, they were to carve their destination into a tree or post, and if the move had happened under distress or attack, they were to also carve a cross above it. There was no cross. To White, this meant his people had relocated to CROATOAN voluntarily and safely, likely to be closer to a native community they trusted, perhaps to secure food, perhaps to await his return in a location less exposed. It should have been, by his own arranged code, a message of reassurance rather than horror. And yet, White never reached CROATOAN to confirm it. A violent storm arose as his ship prepared to sail the short distance to the island, damaging the vessel's anchors and endangering the crew, and the ship's captain refused to risk the journey. With supplies running low and the hurricane season threatening the return voyage to England, the expedition turned back across the Atlantic, leaving the fate of the Roanoke colonists forever unconfirmed. White would spend the remaining years of his life attempting and failing to raise funds for another expedition to find his family. He died without ever learning what became of his daughter, his granddaughter, who had vanished into the American wilderness, carrying nothing behind them but a single carved word.
As the investigation into Roanoke moves toward the final and most human dimension, it becomes necessary to step back from the archaeological debates and return to the individuals at the center of this story. Because it is easy, after 4 centuries of academic argument, to lose sight of the fact that these were not abstract historical puzzle pieces, but real people facing an impossible situation with no modern conveniences, no guarantee of rescue, and no way of knowing whether the ship that had carried John White away would ever return. Eleanor Dare was likely no older than 20 when she gave birth to Virginia Dare on Roanoke Island, an ocean away from everything familiar, in a settlement already straining under supply shortages and uncertain relations with their neighbors. She would have spent the following 3 years raising an infant in near constant uncertainty, watching the horizon for a ship that repeatedly failed to appear, aware that her own father, the colony's governor, was somewhere across an ocean, fighting bureaucratic and military obstacles entirely beyond her control or knowledge. Whatever ultimately happened to Eleanor and her daughter, whether they survived through integration with the CROATOAN, whether they were among those who moved inland, or whether they perished in the earliest and most desperate months following White's departure, their story represents one of the most profound and undertold human dramas in early American history. A story of a mother and infant caught at the exact intersection of imperial ambition, colonial neglect, and indigenous diplomacy, with no say in the forces that would determine their fate. The broader colonist population reflected a similarly diverse cross-section of Elizabethan English society, including farmers, artisans, and entire families who had chosen to relocate permanently rather than serve as a temporary military garrison, a crucial distinction that separated this 1587 expedition from the earlier, more transient 1585 attempt.
These were people who had sold or abandoned property in England, who had made an irreversible decision to build a new life across the Atlantic, believing that continued English support and resupply would follow as promised. Their trust in that promise and the Crown's failure to honor it in time represents one of the earliest and most consequential examples of colonial abandonment in American history, a pattern that would recur in various forms throughout the subsequent century as European powers repeatedly overextended their colonial ambitions relative to their actual logistical capacity to support and defend the settlements they established. This pattern of overextension had lasting consequences for how subsequent English colonization efforts were structured and funded. When the Virginia Company organized the Jamestown expedition 20 years later, the lessons of Roanoke, though never explicitly stated in surviving company records as a direct cause, appear to have influenced a shift toward more heavily capitalized, better supplied, and more consistently resupplied colonial ventures, supported by a joint stock corporate structure designed specifically to spread financial risk and ensure more reliable logistical support than Raleigh's more personally financed and improvisational Roanoke expeditions had provided. In this sense, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists, tragic as it was for the individuals involved, contributed indirectly to a more resilient institutional model of colonization that would ultimately allow Jamestown to survive its own catastrophic early years, including a period so devastating that colonists nearly abandoned the settlement entirely during the winter of 1609 to 1610,
a period colonial records refer to using a phrase describing the starving time, during which the Jamestown population was reduced by disease and starvation to a small fraction of its original size, before a resupply fleet arrived just as the survivors were preparing to abandon the colony altogether.
That Jamestown survived where Roanoke did not was less a matter of fundamentally different circumstances and more a matter of narrower margins of luck, timing, and institutional support. A sobering reminder of how thin the line was between the settlements that became the celebrated founding stories of American history and the ones that vanished into unresolved mystery. The political context surrounding Roanoke's abandonment also deserves closer examination, because the Spanish Armada crisis that stranded John White in England was not a minor bureaucratic inconvenience, but one of the most significant military confrontations in early modern European history, a conflict that would determine whether England remained an independent Protestant nation or fell under Spanish Catholic domination. Queen Elizabeth's government, faced with an existential threat to national survival, made the entirely rational decision to prioritize every available ship and resource toward coastal defense rather than toward a small, distant colonial venture, whose ongoing survival, however important to men like Raleigh and White, paled in comparison to the immediate threat facing the English homeland itself. This context does not excuse the suffering inflicted upon the stranded colonists, but it does explain the mechanism by which their abandonment occurred, transforming the story from one of simple negligence into a more historically accurate portrait of how individual colonial ventures could become collateral damage within much larger geopolitical conflicts entirely beyond their control or awareness. The colonists on Roanoke Island had no way of knowing that their fate was being decided not by any failure of their own preparation or diplomacy, but by naval strategy sessions occurring in London and Plymouth, where officials weighed the survival of 115 distant colonists against the survival of the English nation itself. Sir Walter Raleigh's own role in this unfolding tragedy adds a further layer of political complexity to the story, because Raleigh, despite holding the royal charter that authorized the colony, and despite bearing significant responsibility for its establishment, never personally traveled to America to oversee the venture he had financed and organized. Raleigh's fortunes at court were themselves subject to the volatile currents of Elizabethan politics, and his attention and resources were increasingly divided among multiple competing ventures and court obligations throughout the late 1880s, limiting the priority he was able to give to sustaining the Roanoke colony specifically at the moment it needed support most urgently. Raleigh did make gestures toward continued support, including funding at least one additional relief expedition attempt beyond White's own efforts, but these efforts ultimately proved as unsuccessful as White's, hampered by the same combination of wartime shipping restrictions and competing priorities that had stranded White himself. By the mid-1590s, Raleigh's charter for Virginia had lapsed without a successful colony ever having been firmly established, and his attention shifted toward other ventures, including his ill-fated expeditions in search of gold in South America, ventures that would eventually contribute to his falling out of royal favor and his eventual execution in 1618, decades after the Roanoke colonists had vanished. A fate that meant Raleigh himself, like John White, would die without ever learning the true resolution of the mystery he had set in motion. The economic and cultural significance of the Roanoke story extends well beyond the immediate fate of the colonists themselves, shaping how subsequent generations of English and American writers, artists, and politicians would construct national origin narratives. Virginia Dare, as the first English child born in America, became an enduring symbol invoked repeatedly throughout American history, her image and story deployed in wildly varying political and cultural contexts across the centuries, from 19th century American nationalist writings celebrating supposed English pioneering spirit to later and more troubling appropriations of her memory by explicitly racist and nativist political movements in the 20th century, seeking to construct a mythologized narrative narrative of pure Anglo-Saxon American origins, entirely ignoring the historical evidence suggesting that any surviving descendants of Virginia Dare and her fellow colonists likely became part of indigenous communities through intermarriage and cultural integration, rather than remaining a separate, isolated English bloodline. This layered and often contested cultural legacy demonstrates how historical mysteries, when left unresolved, become vulnerable to appropriation by later political movements seeking to fill the historical silence with narratives serving contemporary ideological purposes rather than historical accuracy. A pattern of historical manipulation that makes the ongoing archaeological and genetic investigation into Roanoke's true fate not merely an academic exercise, but an important corrective against centuries of politically motivated myth-making. The modern archaeological effort to resolve the Roanoke mystery has entered a particularly active phase over the past 2 decades, driven largely by the work of the First Colony Foundation, a non-profit research organization founded specifically to conduct systematic, methodical excavations across multiple candidate sites associated with the lost colonists, moving beyond the more speculative and sensationalized theories that dominated earlier popular treatments of the mystery.
Excavations conducted at Site X, an inland location in present-day Bertie County, North Carolina, corresponding to the hidden mark discovered beneath the patch on John White's original map, have uncovered English pottery fragments dating to the late 16th century, alongside other artifacts consistent with a small English presence at that location during the relevant historical period. These findings, while not conclusively proving that the main body of Roanoke colonists relocated to this specific site, provide tangible physical evidence that English colonists were present and active at locations beyond the original Roanoke Island fort during the years following the colony's disappearance, lending credibility to theories of dispersed relocation rather than a single unified fate befalling all 115 colonists simultaneously. Parallel archaeological work conducted on Hatteras Island, the historical location of the CROATOAN settlement referenced in the carved word John White discovered in 1590, has similarly yielded artifacts of English origin, including a signet ring bearing a design historians have linked to a specific English gentry family with documented connections to the original Roanoke expedition, along with other small items of European manufacture found in archaeological layers consistent with continued Native American habitation rather than a separate, isolated English enclave. This pattern of evidence, English items integrated into ongoing indigenous material culture rather than concentrated within a distinct and separate colonial settlement, aligns closely with the assimilation theory supported by John Lawson's early 18th century account of grey-eyed Hatteras community members claiming English ancestry, reinforcing the interpretation that at least some of the Roanoke colonists successfully integrated into Croatoan society, living out their lives as members of that community rather than maintaining a separate English identity that might have left more distinct, isolated archaeological traces. Despite these significant advances, no single archaeological site has yet produced conclusive evidence definitively identifying human remains or unambiguous, undisputed proof tracing directly back to specific named individuals among the 158 colonists, meaning the investigation, even after decades of dedicated archaeological and genetic research, remains fundamentally a matter of accumulating circumstantial evidence, rather than achieving the kind of definitive, singular discovery that would fully and finally resolve the mystery beyond any scholarly dispute. This ongoing uncertainty is not a failure of the researchers involved, many of whom have dedicated entire careers to this specific historical question, but rather a reflection of the inherent limitations of archaeological and genetic investigation when applied to a small, dispersed population living among a much larger indigenous society over 4 centuries ago, in a coastal environment subject to significant erosion, flooding, and land use changes that have likely destroyed or obscured much of the physical evidence that might otherwise have survived. The enduring significance of the Roanoke mystery, then, lies not in any singular dramatic revelation waiting to be uncovered, but in what the ongoing investigation itself reveals about the nature of historical truth and memory. Roanoke stands as a powerful reminder that history is rarely a simple linear narrative with clean resolutions, but is instead a constantly evolving process of investigation, reinterpretation, and, in cases like this one, genuine and permanent uncertainty that must be honestly acknowledged rather than artificially resolved for the sake of narrative satisfaction. The story of the Lost Colony has survived for over 400 years precisely because it resists easy resolution, forcing each new generation of historians, archaeologists, and descendant communities to grapple with the same fundamental questions that confronted John White when he stood before that carved wooden post in 1590. Not simply what happened to these specific 115 people, but what their disappearance reveals about the fragility of early colonial ventures, the complexity of indigenous and European relationships during this critical period of contact, and the ways in which historical memory can be shaped, distorted, and ultimately weaponized by later generations seeking to serve their own political and cultural purposes. What remains beyond dispute, verified by John White's own contemporary account and corroborated by subsequent archaeological and documentary evidence, is this. In 1587, 115 English men, women, and children established a colony on Roanoke Island, believing they had been promised the ongoing support of their home government. Their governor was forced by desperate circumstance to leave them and seek help, only to be trapped for 3 years by a war he had no part in and could not influence. When he finally returned, he found no violence, no destruction, and no despair carved into the wood his people left behind, but a single calm word pointing toward an alliance with people who had shown them more loyalty than their own crown. Whether those colonists lived out full lives among the CROATOAN, whether some moved further inland and met a different fate entirely, or whether their story ended in ways the historical record has simply failed to preserve, their disappearance remains not merely an unsolved case file from the earliest days of English America, but a profound testament to the human beings who crossed an ocean on the strength of a promise, and whose ultimate fate, whatever it truly was, continues to challenge every assumption about what it meant to be lost, to be found, and to belong in a world still being drawn for the very first time.